within the next couple of months, it is likely that there will be direct US military involvement in Ukraine, with Russia now openly supporting and recognizing separatist groups in the Donbass region on the eastern edge of the country, and apparently moving to aid them militarily in its separation. This is not the first time Russia has sent military units into Ukraine, but it is the first time since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea that the threat of military action has been overt rather than covert. When conflict erupts, you are going to see a swarm of media stories in Western nations trying to outline the complexity of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union, while ignoring certain inconvenient truths. You will see many of these stories construct a narrative which then oversimplifies the situation and paints Russia as the monstrous aggressor. The goal will be to convince the public that our involvement in Ukraine is a moral and geopolitical necessity. There will be attempts to gain American favor and a call for US boots on the ground. Joe Biden will be at the forefront of this push. The surface trigger for the confrontation is obviously rooted 2009 decision by Western powers and Ukrainian officials to consider the country for membership in NATO. Most of Russia's actions when dealing with Ukraine can be owed to NATO involvement in the region, including the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. Strategically, it makes sense. Imagine if Mexico suddenly announced it was joining a military alliance with China, and that Chinese military assets were going to be transferred near the US southern border. It would not end well. To be sure, Russia has a history of hypocritical behavior when it comes to its involvement in the affairs of its neighbors. For example, only a few months ago, Kazakhstan was facing mass protests which the government claimed were caused by foreign manipulation. Zero proof was presented to justify this assertion. However, the claim was enough to rationalize the deployment of 2,300 Russian troops over the border to shut down protests. In reality, citizens of Kazakhstan were angry over a spike in inflation and high gas prices which continue to grind down the middle class and those in poverty. In 2019, only 4% of the population lived under the official poverty line. In 2020, that number exploded to 14% of the population. Accurate numbers are difficult to find for 2021, but it is likely that poverty levels are now closer to 16% to 20%. The reasons for civil unrest were obvious and justified, but the protesting Kazakhs were accused of being pawns of foreign enemies. As I have noted in many articles lately, this is a typical strategy of corrupt governments, trying to retain power when the people rise up and rebel for legitimate reasons. Again, imagine if the Canadian government under Trudeau asked for US military assistance in scattering the trucker protests against his draconian vaccine mandates. We need to look at these decisions in context in order to grasp how insane they really are. Ironically, Russia is happy to support the unrest of separatists in Ukraine while also helping to silence unrest in Kazakhstan. Keep this pattern in mind, because it will help in understanding how events surrounding Russia reflect the global trend that might affect Americans in the future. The diplomatic mess between Ukraine and Russia can be blamed in part on both sides, and it's this kind of historical ambiguity where globalists tend to thrive. The fog of war helps to obscure establishment activities, and often it is hard for people to see who is truly benefiting from the chaos until it's too late. It is my belief that the Ukraine problem is at least partially engineered, and that it is designed as a first domino in a chain of intended crises. I don't think there is anything unique to the Ukraine conflict for the globalists. They could have just as easily tried to initiate a regional war in Taiwan, North Korea, Iran, etc. There are numerous powder keg countries that they have been cultivating for a couple of decades. We should not hyper-focus on who is to blame between Ukraine or Russia. We should focus on the effects that will result from any major regional disaster and how the globalists exploit such catastrophes to further the agenda of total centralization of power. The Ukraine scenario could be easily diffused if both sides took some basic diplomatic measures, but this is not going to happen. NATO officials could take a step back from the pursuit of adding Ukraine to the ranks. The US could stop pouring in cash weaponry into Ukraine to the tune of $5.4 billion since 2014. Over 90 tons of military equipment has been sent to the country in 2022 alone. Russia could stop sending covert special operations units into the Donbass and be more willing to come to the table to discuss diplomatic solutions. The reason these things do not happen is because they are not allowed to happen by the power brokers behind the curtain. We are all aware of the globalist influences behind US and NATO leaders. We present the undeniable evidence of this on a regular basis. Biden's penchant for globalist institutions is well known. But what about Russia? There are some in the alternative media and liberty movement who falsely believe that Russia is anti-globalist. Nothing could be further from the truth. I myself am also struggling to think, because I hear news that that Putin is anti-globalist, and he's trying to put a stop in the plans. But as with many political leaders, Putin will sometimes use anti-globalist rhetoric, but his relationships tell another story. In Putin's first autobiography titled First Person, he discusses with fondness his first encounter with New World Order globalist Henry Kissinger as a member of the FSB, formerly the KGB. As Putin rose through the political ranks, he maintained a steady friendship with Kissinger. So to this day, they have regular lunches, and Kissinger has been an advisor to multiple branches of the Kremlin. It doesn't stop there, though. Putin and the Kremlin have also kept a steady dialogue with the World Economic Forum, the project of the now notorious globalist Klaus Schwab. In fact, only last year, Russia announced it was joining the WEF's Fourth Industrial Revolution network, which focuses on economic socialization, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and a host of other globalist interests which will all lead to worldwide technocracy and tyranny. Again, the Russian government is not anti-globalist. This claim is nonsense and always has been. I would attribute the fantasy of Russian opposition to a steady stream of propaganda and what I call the false East-West paradigm. The fraudulent notion that the globalist agenda is a purely Western or American agenda, and that countries like China and Russia are opposed to it. If you look at the close interactions between the East and the globalists, this idea completely falls apart. I suppose that China and Russia is accelerating too much, letting the people see that they're going fast, and they're supposed to maintain a steady speed. And this is why they oppose. It is easier to rise covertly instead of overtly. Back to the article. It's important to understand that most conflicts between the East and the West are engineered conflicts, and the leaders of both sides are not really at odds with each other. Like, there are no true friends, there are no true enemies. Something like that, yeah. Rather, these wars are kabuki together. They are wars of convenience to achieve covert ends, while mesmerizing the masses with the moments of terror and calamity. For anyone who has doubts about this, I highly recommend they read the thoroughly researched and evidenced works of professional historian and economist Anthony Sutton, who quite excellently stumbled onto the facts surrounding the globalist conspiracy. He went on to expose their habit of playing both sides of nearly every war over the past century, from Bolshevik Revolution to World War II and onward. The strategy of order out of chaos is nothing new. It's something that the globalists have been doing for a very long time. The number of open revelations post-COVID about the Great Reset that the globalists have publicly admitted to is so staggering that their plans can no longer be denied. Any skeptics at this point should be suspected of having a single-digit IQ. So now that we have established the reality of globalist involvement in both the West and in Russia, we need to ask ourselves how they benefit. We need to ask ourselves how they benefit from initiating a crisis between these powers of Ukraine. What do they get out of it? As I've noted in recent articles, it appears to me that Ukraine is a Plan B attempt to conjure more smoke and mirrors where the COVID pandemic failed to satisfy the Great Reset plan. Because it was, the war was supposed to happen first. And then biological weapons were supposed to be released. So that during that time biological weapons were released, that would be the case where they are understood, but unfortunately not. So, going back again, because Klaus Schwab and the WEF has constantly asserted they saw the pandemic as the perfect opportunity to force the industrial revolution on the world. As globalist Rahm Emanuel once opined in the wake of the 2008 economic crash, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. The WF is an old hand at this tactic. Klaus Schwab also used the same exact language right after the credit crash of 2008, and he has used after the spread of COVID, always trying to sell global governance as the solution to every disaster. What we are experiencing is the birth of a new era, a wake-up call to overhaul our institutions, our systems, and above all, our thinking, and to adjust our attitudes and values to the needs of a world which rightly expects a much higher degree of responsibility and accountability, he explained. If we recognize this crisis as being really transformational, we can lay the foundations for a more stable and more sustainable and even more prosperous world. Klaus Schwab on the Global Redesign Initiative, 2009. But yeah, I mean, we know that perhaps the world it goes back to, it activates the primal mindset. Schwab jumped the gun back then, just as he jumped the gun in 2020 when he declared the Great Reset an inevitability in the face of COVID. The globalists must have expected a much higher death rate from the virus because they were practically dancing the streets, elated over the amount of power they could steal in the name of protecting the public from a global health threat. If you look at the WEF and Gates Foundation simulation of the COVID pandemic event 201, which was held only 2 months before the real thing happened, they clearly expected COVID to do way more damage, predicting an initial death tally of 65 million. This never happened. It isn't even close. It's hard to say why an obvious bioweapon like COVID failed to do the job. Viruses tend to mutate rapidly in the wild and behave differently than they do in a lab setting. I would even consider the possibility of divine intervention. Whatever the reason, the globalists did not get what they wanted, and now they need yet another crisis to oil the gears of the reset machine. With the already tiny death rate of COVID now dropping even further from the Omicron variant. The really tiny jet now dropping even further with the Omicron variant. And half the states of the US in full defiance of the vax mandates, it is only a matter of time before the rest of the world asks why they are still under medical authoritarianism. War in Ukraine and the mere threat of that war expanding beyond the region could accomplish a number of things COVID has not. It provides an ongoing cover for the stagflationary collapse which is now in full swing in the US. The supply chain problems that continue globally, as well as the destabilization of the European economy. In particular, the EU is strongly reliant on Russian natural gas in order to heat homes and maintain its economy. Russia has strangled natural gas supplies to Europe in the past, and they will do it again. Russian oil exports also fill demand gaps globally, and these exports will be strangled by the sanctions or by the Kremlin deliberately cutting supplies to certain nations. War is always a distraction from economic sabotage. Even though the seeds of financial crashes are often planted and watered well in advance by central banks, the banks never get the blame because international conflicts conveniently take center stage. By extension, economic crises cause mass poverty, mass desperation, mass hysteria, and globalists will say that these dangers require an international solution that they will happily provide in the form of centralization. In the US and in many other Western nations which have a large number of people still defending individual freedom, the globalists clearly want to use tensions with Russia as a means to silence public dissent over authoritarian policies. Already I am seeing numerous instances of establishment officials and leftists on social media, whatever that is, suggesting that liberty activists are pawns of the Russians and that we are being used to divide and conquer. This is nonsense backed out by nothing, but they are trying out the narrative anyway to see if it sticks. I have no doubt that any rebellion in the US against the globalists will be blamed on foreign interventions. As mentioned earlier, the last thing the elites want is movements of free people obstructing the reset in the name of liberty. Oh, this is quite scary because they're so calculating and cold that they will not allow martyrs. Well, given... Yeah, we witnessed this in Canada where Trudeau announced unilateral emergency powers against the trucker protests, giving himself totalitarian levels of control. Even the Russian government has intervened in such public actions to prevent any kind of activist momentum. Biden will try to do the same thing in war. Even a smaller regional war gives him rationale to oppress dissent in the name of public security. Interestingly, martial law in the US is also much easier to legally and historically justify for the government as long as it is done in response to the invasion of a foreign enemy. The Russian influence narrative may very well be in preparation for martial law within America. Whether or not this actually succeeds is another matter. The consequences of a shooting event in Ukraine will be far-reaching, well beyond its extraction for the American public. My intent here is not to suggest only Americans will be affected. My point is that there are certain places in the world that they are naturally resistant. That are naturally resistant to the globalist scheme, and freedom-minded Americans are a primary obstacle. If there is a large-scale rebellion against the Great Reset, it's going to start here. It's going to start not only in the US, but from us. From massive populations speaking out against all these things, against COVID, against everything. In New Zealand particularly, where I live. Unfortunately, people are too well complacent. My point is, if there is a large-scale rebellion against the Great Reset, it's going to start here. The globalists know this as well, which is why the US will undoubtedly be essentially involved in the Ukraine quagmire. While the event would be disastrous for Ukrainians and probably many Russians, there are deeper and more dangerous underlying threats intended for the US, and a war in Ukraine acts as an effective scapegoat for many of them. And this is what these people say. Perhaps that's the truth. I think what we should take is this. And suppose that this is the truth.